What family member ruined their own reputation at a funeral? My 7-year-old daughter Luna was practicing her poem for her grandfather's funeral when my phone rang. It was my sister-in-law Jane. Listen, tomorrow's service is for adults who can handle grief appropriately. Luna's too young, and frankly, after her meltdown at Christmas, we don't need that energy. Luna has selective mutism. She can speak, but anxiety makes her go completely silent around most people. The meltdown Jane referenced was Luna crying when forced to perform a song for 30 relatives she'd never met. But with Grandpa, Luna found her voice. He was the only extended family member she'd talk to freely. Jane, Dad specifically asked Luna to read something. It was his last. Well, he's not here to be disappointed, is he? Besides, the funeral home has strict capacity limits. That was a lie. I'd already called them. No limits. Luna had been sitting beside me coloring a picture for Grandpa's casket. She looked up at me with huge eyes. Aunt Patty doesn't want me there? I muted the phone. We're going, baby. Grandpa wanted you there. Jane texted, the funeral director has your names on a do not admit list. Luna saw it. Like we're bad people? No, sweetheart. Aunt Patty is just sad and making bad choices. Luna spent the next hour practicing her poem in front of her stuffed animals, voice getting stronger each time. Grandpa taught me brave doesn't mean loud. Sometimes brave is showing up when you're scared. My phone buzzed. Mom calling. Jane says Luna's too disruptive. Mom, Dad asked Luna to read. His last request was hearing her voice at his service. Long pause. Come anyway. I'll handle Jane. The next morning, Luna chose her outfit carefully. Grandpa's favorite color purple, with the butterfly necklace he'd given her. She practiced her poem one more time in the mirror, then went completely silent. Her anxiety was kicking in, but her eyes were determined. At the funeral home, Jane stood at the entrance like a bouncer, arms crossed. I specifically said, Mom appeared behind her. Jane, move. This is what Dad would want? Some child making this about her? Luna tugged my hand. In the quietest voice, she whispered, tell her Grandpa said I'm his brave butterfly. Jane heard and scoffed. Oh, please, the selective mutism act? She talks when she wants attention. That's when my brother James arrived with his 3 kids. Hey, Luna, we saved you a seat up front where Grandpa wanted you. Jane's face went red. You knew about this? We all did. Dad talked about Luna's poem for weeks. It was the last thing he was excited about. Inside, Luna sat frozen during the service, clutching her poem. When it was her turn, she walked to the podium, looked at the crowd, and couldn't speak. Jane smirked from her seat. 30 seconds passed. 40. Someone coughed. Luna's eyes filled with tears. Then James's 8-year-old son stood up. You can do it, Luna. Grandpa's listening. Luna took a deep breath. The first line came out as a whisper. My grandpa said hearts speak louder than voices. By the third line, her voice grew stronger. By the end, she was speaking clearly. He said I was his brave butterfly, and butterflies don't need to roar to soar. The entire room was crying, except Jane. After the service, Jane cornered us. That manipulative performance? Mom cut her off. Jane, there's something you should know. Dad's will reading is tomorrow. Finally, someone responsible can handle the estate. Mom smiled coldly. Dad left Luna his piano, the one you've been trying to claim for months. He also left her a college fund. And there's a video. What video? Dad recorded a message 3 days before he died. Should I play it now? Jane went pale. What does it say? Mom pulled out her phone. Grandpa's voice filled the lobby. If you're watching this, it means Jane tried to stop Luna from attending. Jane, I've removed you as executor and from my will entirely. Jane's husband stood up. You tried to ban a 7-year-old from her grandfather's funeral? Jane lunged at Mom, screaming. Security dragged her out, but not before she shrieked. I've been stealing from him for years. You'll never find where I hid it. Everyone froze. But when police searched Grandpa's phone, they found something worse than theft. Jane had been recording Luna without permission for months. The police showed up maybe 3 minutes after Jane screamed about stealing from Dad. I grabbed Luna and pulled her against my chest while 2 officers walked toward Jane, who was still yelling about hidden money and how we'd never find it. Elias just stood there with his mouth open, looking like someone had punched him in the stomach. The funeral director was trying to get everyone else into a side room, herding mourners away from the chaos, but it was too late because every single person had heard Jane admit she'd been stealing from my dying father for years. One officer put handcuffs on Jane while she thrashed and screamed, and the other officer started asking questions about what happened. Detective Willie arrived about 10 minutes later, a tall guy with gray hair who looked tired and sad, like he'd seen too many families fall apart. He asked everyone who witnessed the outburst to stay for statements, and people lined up against the wall looking shocked and uncomfortable in their funeral clothes. I sat down in a chair with Luna in my lap and told Detective Willie everything, about Dad's video message and how it mentioned unauthorized recordings of Luna. Luna had gone completely silent again after her triumph at the podium, her small body shaking against mine as she tried to process what she'd just seen. Detective Willie wrote everything down and asked if I had Dad's phone, and I explained that Mom had it since she was handling his estate. He nodded and went to talk to Mom, who was standing near the windows looking pale and angry. Mom came over after about 20 minutes of police questioning Jane and pulled me aside. She kept her voice low and asked me to take Luna home before this got any worse. I agreed right away because Luna had been through enough today, more than any 7-year-old should have to handle at her own grandfather's funeral. Winston appeared next to us and said he was coming with us, his face gray and shocked at what his sister-in-law had done to our family. We slipped out a side door while Jane was still screaming at the officers, and I carried Luna to the car even though she was getting too big to be carried. The drive home was silent except for Luna's quiet breathing, and Winston's occasional sighs from the back seat. At home, I set Luna down on the couch and she just sat there staring at her hands for about 5 minutes. Then she looked up at me and whispered so quietly I almost missed it, asking if Grandpa knew Aunt Patty was mean. I knelt down in front of her and said yes, that's exactly why he made the video, because he knew Jane would try something, and he wanted to protect Luna. She nodded slowly, and then asked if she could go play with her stuffed animals, needing to escape into her safe pretend world after the overwhelming day. I told her, of course, and watched her walk to her room, her purple dress wrinkled and her butterfly necklace catching the light. Winston sat down at my kitchen table and put his head in his hands, saying sorry over and over even though none of this was his fault. His son Tommy came in from the living room looking confused and asked why the police took his aunt away. Winston struggled to find words to explain adult betrayal to an 8-year-old who'd just been trying to support his cousin. He finally said that sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices and have to face consequences, which seemed to satisfy Tommy for the moment. Mom called around 6 that evening to say Jane had been arrested and charged with elder financial abuse after police found evidence on Dad's phone. The unauthorized recordings were still being investigated, but the first searches of Jane's devices showed she'd been filming Luna at family gatherings for at least 6 months, maybe longer. I felt sick hearing that, imagining Jane pointing her phone at Luna during Christmas and Thanksgiving and birthday parties, capturing my daughter's most vulnerable moments. After I hung up with Mom, I spent the rest of the night on my laptop researching what unauthorized recording of a minor meant legally. My stomach turned reading about exploitation and privacy violations, and how people sometimes collected videos of disabled kids for reasons I didn't want to think about. Luna woke up twice with nightmares, crying without making any sound, her anxiety stealing her voice even in sleep. I held her both times and rocked her until she fell back asleep, whispering that she was safe and Grandpa was proud of her. The next morning, the family attorney Nora Shields called to schedule a meeting about Dad's will and the missing assets Jane had mentioned. She explained in this tired voice that estate theft cases can take years to untangle, especially when the thief had access to accounts for a long time and might have hidden money in multiple places. I made an appointment for later that week and tried not to think about how Jane had been stealing from Dad while he was dying. Detective Willie called around lunch asking to interview Luna with a child psychologist present. I felt terrified about putting Luna through more trauma, but he promised they'd go slowly and Luna could stop anytime, and he said understanding what Jane recorded was crucial for building the criminal case. I agreed and we scheduled it for 3 days out to give Luna time to prepare. Luna's therapist, Dr. Barr, squeezed us in for an emergency appointment that afternoon to help Luna get ready for the police interview. Luna sat in the familiar office with her stuffed rabbit and managed to whisper a few words to Dr. Barr about feeling scared and confused. Dr. Barr said Luna was making more progress expressing her feelings than she had in months, possibly because her breakthrough at the funeral had given her confidence that her voice mattered. I watched Luna trace patterns on the carpet while she talked in whispers to Dr. Barr, and I tried to focus on the progress instead of the fear, tried to believe we'd get through this even though Jane had violated my daughter in ways I was still discovering. Winston showed up at my door around 8 that evening with Tommy in tow, saying he thought the kids should spend time together doing normal kid things instead of sitting around scared adults. I let them in, and Tommy went straight to Luna's room where she was sitting on her floor surrounded by stuffed animals, arranging them in careful rows like she always did when anxiety took over. Tommy sat down cross-legged next to her and picked up her rabbit without asking, just started making it hop around in circles. Luna watched him for a minute before picking up her bear and making it follow the rabbit, and they played like that for maybe 20 minutes without saying much. I stood in the doorway pretending to check on laundry while actually listening to every sound, and eventually Tommy's voice came out quiet and serious, asking if Luna was okay after what happened with his aunt. Luna nodded but didn't speak, and Tommy told her his mom had done bad things, but that didn't make Luna bad. His 8-year-old logic trying to make sense of adult cruelty in the only way he knew how. He said his dad told him that sometimes grown-ups make terrible choices, and kids shouldn't have to fix it, and Luna reached over and squeezed his hand for just a second, before going back to lining up her animals. Winston and I sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee neither of us wanted, and he kept apologizing even though I told him to stop, his guilt about being related to Jane eating at him in ways I understood but couldn't fix. 3 days later, I drove Luna to the police station for her interview, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the whole way there. Detective Willie met us in the lobby and walked us to a room that looked nothing like what I expected, with soft couches and toys and walls painted light blue instead of the harsh interrogation spaces you see on TV. Dr. Barr was already there waiting, and Luna climbed into my lap the second we sat down, her whole body tense and small. Willie pulled out his phone and explained he needed to show Luna some photos from Jane's device, asking if she could point to any that made her feel uncomfortable or scared. Luna's fingers twisted in her butterfly necklace as Willie swiped through images, most of them looking like normal family gathering shots, until Luna's hand suddenly shot out and she pointed at one from Christmas. Willie asked her to tap the screen if she saw more, and Luna went through maybe 15 photos total, all of them from different family events over the past year. In each one, Jane had clearly been focusing the camera on Luna during moments when her selective mutism was most obvious, capturing her frozen at the kids' table during Thanksgiving, silent in the corner at someone's birthday party, crying at that Christmas disaster Jane had referenced. Willie took notes on every photo Luna identified, his voice staying calm and gentle the whole time, and Luna managed to nod or shake her head to answer his yes or no questions, even though no words would come out. When he asked if she'd ever seen Jane filming her, Luna nodded hard and pointed to her own phone in a gesture that meant Jane had been obvious about it sometimes, not even hiding what she was doing. After Luna finished pointing out photos, Willie pulled me aside while Dr. Barr stayed with Luna and explained what they'd found in the rest of Jane's recordings. She'd been filming Luna specifically during moments when her disability was most apparent, sometimes zooming in on Luna's face when she was struggling to speak, capturing every frozen silence and anxiety response with what Willie described as disturbing focus. The recordings went back at least 8 months based on metadata, possibly longer if Jane had deleted earlier files, and there were over 40 separate videos just of Luna. Willie's theory was that Jane might have been building documentation to argue Luna was too impaired to inherit anything, creating a record of disability that could be used to challenge Grandpa's will by claiming Luna wasn't competent. The other possibility he mentioned made my stomach turn worse, that Jane might have been part of some network that collected and shared videos of disabled kids, though they hadn't found evidence of distribution yet. He said they were analyzing Jane's online activity and communications to understand her full intent, but regardless of motive, the unauthorized recording of a minor was illegal, and the focus on Luna's vulnerable moments showed clear predatory behavior. I called Mom from the parking lot after we left the police station, Luna already buckled in the back seat with her headphones on watching videos on my phone. Mom answered on the first ring, and I told her what Willie had explained about the recordings, how Jane had been studying Luna's disability like she was documenting an animal in a zoo. Mom's voice cracked immediately and she started crying, saying she should have seen it, should have noticed Jane always had her phone out around Luna, should have questioned why Jane was so interested in Luna's therapy progress and school struggles. She kept saying she'd failed to protect her granddaughter from someone who was supposed to be family, that she'd trusted Jane because you're supposed to trust family, and now Luna had been violated in ways that would take years to undo. I tried to tell Mom it wasn't her fault, but she wasn't hearing it, just kept crying and saying she should have been more careful, should have watched Jane more closely, should have believed Luna when she'd seemed uncomfortable around Jane at past gatherings. We stayed on the phone for maybe 10 minutes with Mom crying and me trying not to cry, while Luna sat in the back seat completely silent, and when we finally hung up, I sat in that parking lot for another 5 minutes before I could pull myself together enough to drive home. 2 days later, Mom, Winston, and I met with Nora at her office to go through Grandpa's estate paperwork. Nora spread bank statements across her conference table and explained the situation was more tangled than anyone had realized because Jane had been joint on several of Grandpa's accounts, supposedly to help him manage finances as he got sicker. The statements showed regular transfers from Grandpa's accounts to accounts in Jane's name only, sometimes $2,000 or $3,000 at a time, adding up to over $60,000 across 3 years. Nora explained the legal challenge was proving these were theft rather than gifts, since Jane could claim Grandpa had authorized the transfers and wanted her to have the money. We'd need to show a pattern of deception, or find evidence that Grandpa didn't know about the transfers, which meant going through years of records and possibly depositions from bank employees. Mom pulled out her phone and showed Nora the video Grandpa had recorded, and Nora watched it twice before saying this changed everything because Grandpa explicitly stated Jane stole from him. Nora explained that Grandpa's video message gave prosecutors major leverage for the criminal case since it was essentially a dying declaration that Jane had committed theft. She said the estate could pursue civil recovery to get the money back through lawsuits, but criminal prosecution might actually recover more if the judge ordered Jane to pay restitution as part of her sentencing. The criminal case would take months to build, and possibly a year or more to get through trial, but a guilty verdict with restitution attached would give us a court order to seize Jane's assets and garnish any future wages. Nora recommended we let the criminal case play out first before deciding whether to file separate civil suits, since a criminal conviction would make the civil case much easier to win. She warned us that even with all this evidence, we might never recover the full amount if Jane had already spent the money or hidden it in places we couldn't find. And legal fees for both criminal and civil proceedings would eat into whatever we did recover. That night, Luna woke up screaming without making any sound, her mouth open but nothing coming out, her whole body shaking in her bed. I held her until she fell back asleep, and then she woke up again 2 hours later the same way, silent screaming that scared me worse than if she'd been loud. The pattern continued for the next week, with Luna barely sleeping and going completely silent even at home. Not even the whispers she usually managed with me in safe spaces. Dr. Barr squeezed us in for an emergency session and explained that the legal proceedings were re-traumatizing Luna, making her relive the violation every time we had to discuss Jane's crimes or meet with investigators. She warned that Luna was regressing in her therapy progress, losing months of work in just days, and recommended we limit Luna's direct involvement in the legal stuff as much as possible. Dr. Barr said we should let the adults handle the investigation and court proceedings while keeping Luna informed in age-appropriate ways, giving her just enough information to feel safe without drowning her in details about what Jane had done. Winston called me a few days later to say Elias had filed for divorce from Jane. The papers already submitted and a lawyer already hired. He said Elias was completely devastated, that he'd had no idea about the theft or the recordings, and felt like his whole marriage had been a lie. Elias was cooperating fully with the investigation, giving police access to all their shared devices and financial records, and the additional evidence from his cooperation was revealing even more of Jane's deception. Bank records from their joint accounts showed Jane had been moving money around in ways Elias never knew about, and his laptop had cloud backups of Jane's phone that contained even more recordings of Luna than police had initially found. Winston said Elias wanted to maintain some kind of relationship with our family separate from Jane, but I told Winston I needed time to think about that because right now I couldn't look at anyone connected to Jane without feeling sick. 2 weeks after the funeral, the prosecutor's office filed formal charges against Jane, including elder financial abuse, identity theft for opening accounts in Grandpa's name without permission, and 6 counts of unlawful surveillance of a minor. The prosecutor called to explain the charges and said Jane's bail was set at $50,000 because she'd threatened to hide more evidence during her arrest, and since she couldn't post that amount, she was staying in jail until trial. He said the case was strong with Grandpa's video, the bank records and the recordings themselves as evidence, and they were confident about getting a conviction. The trial was probably 8 to 10 months away depending on court schedules, and whether Jane tried to negotiate a plea deal, and he warned that we should prepare for a long process with multiple hearings, and possibly having to testify. Mom came over that evening and we sat on my couch after Luna went to bed, and she finally broke down completely about everything. She said she was mourning Dad while simultaneously dealing with the horror of learning Jane had been stealing from him during his final years, and the two grief processes were tangling together in ways she couldn't separate. Mom told me that Dad had mentioned money going missing a few times, small amounts at first and then bigger chunks, but Jane always had explanations about medical bills or house repairs or helping her kids with school expenses. Mom said she should have questioned those explanations more carefully, instead of just trusting family, should have looked at the bank statements herself, instead of letting Jane handle everything. She blamed herself for being too trusting, for not protecting Dad from theft while he was dying, for not protecting Luna from someone who'd been documenting her vulnerability for months. I tried to tell Mom that Jane had fooled everyone, that predators are good at hiding what they really are, but Mom just kept crying and saying she should have known, should have seen the signs, should have been more careful with the people she let into Dad's life and Luna's life. The next morning, Luna's teacher called while I was making breakfast. She said Luna hadn't spoken a single word in class since we'd been back after the funeral, not even to answer yes or no questions. And while she wanted to be understanding about what Luna was going through, she was worried about how much Luna had pulled back into herself. I thanked her for being patient and promised to talk to Luna's therapist about strategies, but after hanging up, I just stood there staring at the phone. Luna had been making such small progress this year, whispering answers to her teacher occasionally, and now Jane's cruelty had stolen even that tiny victory. I watched Luna eat her cereal in complete silence, her eyes distant, and I wanted to scream at Jane for breaking my daughter's fragile confidence. Nora called that afternoon with news that made my stomach drop. She'd been going through Grandpa's financial records and discovered Jane had opened a credit card in his name about 4 months before he died. The card had $12,000 charged to it, all for personal expenses like clothing and restaurant bills and a weekend trip to some resort. Jane had the statement sent to a P.O. box she controlled, so Grandpa never knew about the debt, and now it was attached to his estate as a legitimate bill until Nora could prove it was fraud. She said she was filing a dispute with the credit card company and adding it to the criminal case, but it would take months to untangle. I asked how someone could be so calculated in stealing from a dying man, and Nora said in her 20 years practicing law, she'd seen family members do terrible things for money, but Jane's systematic theft was among the worst. Winston and I met with the prosecutor 3 days later in a small conference room that smelled like old coffee and stress. The prosecutor was a tired-looking woman who spread files across the table and explained that Jane's case would probably take 8 to 12 months to reach trial. She said they were building a strong case with the bank records, the credit card fraud, Grandpa's video, and the recordings, but Winston and I needed to understand that some of the stolen money might never be recovered. Jane could have hidden cash, spent it already, or moved it somewhere they couldn't trace, and criminal restitution orders didn't guarantee we'd actually get the money back. She asked if we were prepared for a long process with multiple hearings, possible delays, and the stress of potentially having to testify about what Jane had done. Winston looked gray and exhausted, and I just nodded because what choice did we have except to see this through? The prosecutor promised to keep us updated and said Jane remaining in jail was good because it prevented her from hiding more evidence or intimidating witnesses. Luna had a therapy appointment the next day, and her therapist used stuffed animals to help Luna express feelings she couldn't put into words. Luna made one stuffed bear be Grandpa and another smaller bear be herself, and she had them sitting together while other animal toys watched from far away. Then she brought in a wolf toy and had it circle the bears, getting closer and closer, and when her therapist asked what the wolf wanted, Luna whispered that the wolf was pretending to be nice but was really bad. She made the wolf snatch the Grandpa bear away, and the little bear just sat frozen and couldn't move or make sounds. Her therapist asked gently what scared the little bear most, and Luna whispered even quieter that she was scared bad people could pretend to be family, that she couldn't tell who was safe anymore. I sat in the corner of the therapy room trying not to cry, watching my 7-year-old work through the betrayal of learning that someone she'd known her whole life had been secretly hurting her. The therapist recommended a specialized group for kids who'd experienced family trauma, and I enrolled Luna the following week. The group met twice a week and used art and play to help children process complex emotions about adults who'd betrayed their trust. Luna's first session, she sat silently in a circle with 5 other kids while the group leader explained that everyone there had experienced something confusing and scary with a family member. One boy drew a picture of his uncle who'd stolen his college fund, and a girl made a clay figure of her grandmother who'd said mean things about her disability. Luna watched them share their stories through art, and when it was her turn, she drew a butterfly with a broken wing. She didn't speak, but she pointed to the butterfly when the leader asked if that was how she felt, and I saw her shoulders relax slightly, knowing other children understood feeling unsafe around relatives. Mom officially took over as executor of Grandpa's estate 2 weeks after the funeral, signing papers in Nora's office while I watched. Nora spread out account statements and credit card bills and lists of suspicious transactions, explaining that Mom would need to close the fraudulent accounts, document every questionable charge, and provide evidence for both the criminal case and the civil lawsuit. Mom looked overwhelmed by the complexity of untangling years of Jane's theft, but Nora walked her through each step patiently. They set up a system for tracking which accounts had been reviewed, which showed clear evidence of fraud, and which were ambiguous enough that proving theft would be difficult. I helped Mom organize papers into folders that evening, both of us quiet as we handled documents proving how thoroughly Jane had violated Dad's trust during his final years. 3 weeks after the funeral, I was folding laundry when Luna appeared in my bedroom doorway. She stood there for a long moment, and then in a clear voice that shocked me, she asked if Grandpa knew she loved him before he died. I dropped the shirt I was holding and knelt down to her level, taking her small hands in mine. I told her absolutely yes, that her poem at the funeral proved to everyone how much she loved him, that Grandpa had talked about her constantly in his final weeks, and knew exactly how special their bond was. Luna nodded slowly, her eyes searching my face like she was checking if I was telling the truth, and then she turned and walked back to her room without another word. I sat on my bedroom floor and cried because speaking that one sentence had clearly exhausted all of Luna's emotional resources, and I didn't know how to help her carry this weight. Elias reached out a few days later through a careful email asking if he could maintain some relationship with our family separate from Jane. He wrote that he was horrified by what his wife had done, that he was cooperating fully with police and prosecutors, and that he understood if we never wanted to see him again, but hoped we might consider supervised visits where he could see the kids. I forwarded the email to Winston, and we talked on the phone for over an hour about whether Elias deserved a chance. Winston pointed out that Elias had confronted Jane at the funeral, had filed for divorce immediately, and had provided evidence that strengthened the case against her. We decided that Elias was also a victim of Jane's deception, that she'd hidden her cruelty from him just like she'd hidden it from the rest of us. We agreed to supervised visits where Elias could see Tommy and Luna together with multiple adults present, watching carefully to make sure he respected Luna's boundaries and didn't pressure her to speak or interact. Detective Willie called with an update that made me feel sick all over again. Jane's phone had revealed she'd been in contact with several other family members of children with disabilities, and they'd been discussing something they called a documentary project about selective mutism. The investigation had expanded because police discovered Jane might have been part of a network gathering content about disabled children, though her role appeared to be collecting images and information, rather than distributing it to worse places. Willie said they were contacting the other families to inform them their children might have been recorded without permission, and they were building a case for additional charges related to conspiracy to exploit minors. He warned that the investigation could take months to fully untangle, because they needed to identify everyone involved and determine exactly what Jane had planned to do with the recordings. I had to tell Luna that the bad things Jane did were even worse than we first knew. We sat together on her bed surrounded by her stuffed animals, and I explained in the simplest terms I could that Jane had been talking to other people about Luna and sharing information that wasn't hers to share. Luna's face went very pale, and in the tiniest whisper, she asked if other kids got hurt because of her. My heart broke into pieces hearing her take responsibility for Jane's choices, and I pulled her close and told her that nothing Jane did was Luna's fault, that bad adults make bad choices, and kids are never to blame for what adults decide to do. Luna nodded against my shoulder but didn't speak again for the rest of the day, and I knew that learning about Jane's wider betrayal had damaged her trust even more deeply than before. Willie called 3 days later with news that made my stomach drop all over again. The investigation had grown bigger than just Jane filming Luna, because they'd found messages on her phone discussing a documentary project about selective mutism with several other people. He explained they were building a case for conspiracy to exploit minors, and that Jane's sentence could include real prison time now, not just probation. I asked what this meant for Luna, and he said the prosecutor wanted to meet with our family lawyer to discuss civil damages for emotional harm beyond just the stolen money. I called Nora immediately, and she scheduled a meeting for the following week, explaining that conspiracy charges would strengthen our ability to sue Jane for what she'd done to Luna psychologically. Luna's school counselor called me in for a meeting 2 weeks after Willie's update. She sat across from me in her small office and explained that Luna's teachers had noticed her going completely silent in class since the funeral, not speaking even when called on directly. The counselor recommended setting up a 504 plan to formally accommodate Luna's selective mutism, which would give her alternative ways to show what she knew without having to talk out loud. I signed the paperwork feeling grateful for the support, but also heartbroken because trauma had made Luna's disability worse, right when she'd been making progress with Grandpa. The counselor assured me that kids often regress after major losses, and that the accommodations would help Luna succeed at the school, even while she healed from everything Jane had done. Mom called me over to her house one afternoon, because she'd found something while cleaning out Dad's study. She led me to his desk where a wooden box sat open, filled with papers and envelopes. Mom's hands shook as she showed me letters Dad had written to Luna, each one labeled with a future birthday from age 8 through 18. I picked up the first one and read his handwriting talking about his brave butterfly and how proud he was of her finding her voice. We both started crying reading his words because he'd known Luna would need encouragement on birthdays when he wouldn't be there anymore. I gathered the letters carefully and took them home to save for Luna when she was ready, knowing these messages from Grandpa would mean everything to her someday. Winston showed up at my door looking exhausted a few days later. He came in and collapsed on my couch, telling me that Tommy had been getting in trouble at the school for pushing other kids and talking back to teachers. Winston said Tommy kept asking why his aunt was in jail, and why Luna was so sad all the time, and he didn't know how to explain adult cruelty to an 8-year-old who just wanted everyone to be happy again. I suggested we look into a sibling support group for Tommy, because Luna's trauma was affecting him too, even though he wasn't the direct victim. Winston agreed immediately, and we spent an hour researching groups for kids dealing with family crisis, finding one that met twice a month at the community center. We called together and got Tommy enrolled, both of us recognizing that healing had to include all the kids caught in Jane's mess. 4 months crawled by with legal proceedings moving at the pace of frozen molasses. Then Nora called with major news. Jane had accepted a plea deal rather than face trial, pleading guilty to elder financial abuse and unlawful surveillance in exchange for prosecutors dropping the exploitation conspiracy charges. She'd been sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay $90,000 in restitution to Grandpa's estate. Nora warned me that actually collecting that money would be nearly impossible since Jane had no real assets and would be in prison, but at least the court had recognized the harm she'd caused. I felt relieved we wouldn't have to go through a trial that would drag Luna through more trauma, even though 4 years seemed too short for everything Jane had done. The prosecutor sent us a transcript of Jane's statement in court as part of the plea agreement. I read it alone first before deciding whether to share it with anyone else. Jane had admitted on record that she resented Dad's favoritism toward Luna and wanted to punish both of them for their close relationship. She'd said she couldn't stand watching Dad light up around Luna when he barely tolerated Jane's presence, and that filming Luna's disability had started as a way to prove Luna was manipulating everyone. Reading her words made me feel sick, because her cruelty had been motivated by jealousy of a 7-year-old child's relationship with her grandfather. Jane had been so eaten up by bitterness that she'd stolen from a dying man and violated his granddaughter just to hurt them both. Luna found the transcript on my desk a week later and asked what it was. I'd been careless leaving it out, and now she stood there holding the papers, her eyes wide. She asked in the smallest whisper if she could read it when she was older, because she wanted to understand why Jane hated her so much. I took the papers gently and told her we'd talk to Dr. Barr about it, then called the therapist that same afternoon. Dr. Barr said firmly that Luna shouldn't read Jane's statement until she had better emotional tools to process adult mental illness, maybe not until she was a teenager. For now, Doctor, Barr said, we should tell Luna that Jane was sick in her brain and made terrible choices that weren't Luna's fault at all. Nora started civil proceedings to recover the stolen assets, even though the criminal restitution was already ordered. She called with an update that actually sounded hopeful for once. Jane had hidden money in accounts under her mother's name in another state, and Nora's investigators had tracked down about $40,000 sitting in those accounts. The civil case would take months or even years to fully resolve, but at least we knew where some of the stolen funds had gone. Nora filed paperwork to freeze those accounts while we pursued recovery, and I felt a small spark of hope that maybe we could get back part of what Jane had taken from Luna's future. Luna started speaking more at home as winter turned to spring. Not constantly and not without setbacks, but she'd ask me questions about homework, or tell me about something funny that happened with her stuffed animals. Dr. Barr celebrated this as major progress during our next therapy session, explaining that trauma recovery never moved in a straight line. She said Luna's safe spaces were expanding gradually, which was exactly what healing looked like, even if school and public places still triggered her anxiety into complete silence. I tried to focus on the progress instead of feeling frustrated that Luna still couldn't talk to her teachers or make friends easily. Mom called me into her kitchen one Saturday morning and showed me bank statements spread across her table. She'd decided to use part of her own savings to establish the college fund Dad had intended for Luna, refusing to let Jane's theft steal Luna's future. The fund was smaller than Dad had planned, only about $15,000 compared to the $50,000 he'd wanted to leave, but Mom was determined Luna would have educational opportunities. Winston showed up an hour later and added $5,000 of his own money to the fund, saying our family needed to pull together to honor Dad's wishes. I cried watching them rebuild what Jane had destroyed, knowing Luna would grow up understanding that good people fight to protect what matters. The piano arrived on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks later, 2 delivery workers carefully maneuvering it through our front door and positioning it against the living room wall where I'd cleared space. Luna stood in the doorway watching them work, her eyes huge as she took in the massive instrument that had belonged to Grandpa. The workers left, and Luna walked slowly toward the piano, reaching out one small hand to touch the dark wood surface. She ran her fingers along the keys without pressing down, tracing the pattern of black and white in silence. I sat on the couch giving her space to explore, watching as she circled the piano like it might disappear if she looked away. She climbed onto the bench and sat there for 20 minutes just staring at the keys, her hands folded in her lap. Eventually she pressed one key very gently, the single note hanging in the air. She pressed another, then another, creating random sounds that didn't form any melody. Over the next few days, Luna spent hours at the piano running her fingers over the keys, sometimes pressing them to hear the notes but never playing anything that resembled music. I didn't push her, understanding she needed to connect with the instrument in her own way and her own time. Dr. Barr said this was Luna processing grief through touch and sound, finding a physical connection to Grandpa through the piano he'd loved. 2 weeks after the piano arrived, I heard actual music coming from the living room instead of random notes. Luna had figured out a simple melody, just 5 or 6 notes repeated, but it was deliberate and intentional. She played it over and over, her concentration complete as her small fingers found the right keys. The melodies got more complex as weeks passed, Luna teaching herself basic songs by ear and experimenting with different combinations of notes. Music became another language for her, a way to express feelings when words wouldn't come, and I often heard her playing when she got home from the school or before bed. 6 months after the funeral, Luna's teacher called to tell me Luna had volunteered to read a poem at the school's holiday assembly. My heart jumped into my throat because this was huge, standing in front of the entire school to speak when Luna could barely manage small group conversations. The teacher assured me they'd support Luna completely, and she could stop any time, but Luna had specifically asked to try. The assembly was on a Friday morning, and I took off work to attend, sitting in the back of the gym with my stomach in knots. Luna sat with her class on the floor up front, clutching a piece of paper with her poem written on it. When her teacher called her name, Luna stood up and walked to the microphone on shaky legs, her face pale under the bright lights. She looked out at the crowd of 200 students and parents, opened her mouth, and nothing came out. 30 seconds passed with Luna frozen at the microphone, her hands trembling as she held her paper. I started to stand up, ready to go get her, but her teacher made a calm down gesture telling me to wait. Luna took a huge breath and started reading in the quietest voice, barely audible even with the microphone. She made it through the first stanza, her voice getting slightly stronger. The second stanza came easier, words flowing more naturally as she found her rhythm. Halfway through the third stanza, her voice failed completely, the words stopping mid-sentence as anxiety took over. The gym was completely silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen. Luna's teacher started clapping gently, and the sound spread through the gym as students and parents applauded Luna's bravery, even though she hadn't finished. Luna looked up surprised, and her teacher came over to walk her back to her class, putting an arm around her shoulders. I was crying in the back row, so proud of Luna for trying something that terrified her and getting further than anyone expected. Winston started coming over for dinner every Wednesday night, bringing Tommy with him so the cousins could spend time together. We'd order pizza, or I'd make something simple, keeping it casual and comfortable for the kids. Tommy and Luna would play together after dinner, their friendship growing stronger as they both processed the confusion of Jane's betrayal in their own ways. Tommy asked questions sometimes about why his aunt did bad things, and I tried to answer honestly without giving details too scary for an 8-year-old. Luna seemed less alone having a cousin who understood that adults and families could hurt kids, even though Tommy's experience was different from hers. The kids supported each other through the weirdness of having a family member in prison, Tommy defending Luna at the school when other kids asked nosy questions about the funeral drama. These weekly dinners became a new tradition, our family rebuilding itself without Jane's toxic presence poisoning every gathering. Winston told me how much the dinners meant to him too, giving him and Tommy stability and connection when his own life felt chaotic from the divorce. Elias started visiting once a month under supervised conditions, always with me or Winston present to make sure Luna felt safe. The first visit was awkward. Elias sitting in our living room looking uncomfortable while Luna hid behind me. He asked if he could talk to Luna directly, and I checked with her first, Luna nodding permission but staying close to my side. Elias got down on her level and apologized for not protecting her from Jane, his voice breaking as he told Luna he should have seen what was happening and stopped it. He promised to always respect Luna's boundaries and never push her to talk or hug or interact if she didn't want to. Luna listened silently, then whispered that it wasn't his fault what Jane did. Over the following months, Luna gradually accepted Elias's presence, eventually sitting near him during visits and showing him her piano playing. His genuine guilt and careful respect for Luna's needs helped her understand that not all adults connected to bad people were bad themselves, that Elias had been fooled by Jane too. Dr. Barr introduced exposure therapy during our sessions, using the funeral poem as proof that Luna could succeed even when terrified. The therapy involved Luna practicing speaking in increasingly challenging situations, starting with just Dr. Barr and me in the room, then adding unfamiliar adults one at a time. Progress was incredibly slow with many setbacks. Days when Luna couldn't speak at all, followed by tiny victories like answering a direct question. Dr. Barr reminded us repeatedly that selective mutism doesn't follow a straight path to recovery, that backsliding was normal and didn't erase previous progress. Luna's determination to honor Grandpa's belief in her brave butterfly identity kept her trying even when therapy sessions left her exhausted and frustrated. Some weeks she'd make breakthrough progress, other weeks she'd retreat completely into silence, the anxiety overwhelming her coping strategies. Nora called with unexpected good news about the civil case, her investigators successfully recovering $40,000 from Jane's hidden accounts. The money had been sitting in accounts under Jane's mother's name in another state, and the court ordered it returned to Grandpa's estate. Mom decided to split the recovered funds, using $20,000 to restore what Jane had stolen from the estate, and putting $20,000 into Luna's college fund. It wasn't full restitution for the $60,000 Jane had taken, but it felt like a real victory against Jane's attempt to steal Luna's inheritance. Nora warned that recovering the remaining $20,000 would be nearly impossible with Jane in prison, and no other hidden accounts discovered, but we celebrated getting back as much as we did. Luna asked to visit Grandpa's grave on what would have been his 75th birthday, and we drove to the cemetery together on a sunny Saturday morning. Luna brought fresh flowers and the butterfly necklace he'd given her, wearing it for the first time since the funeral. We stood at his headstone and Luna whispered her poem, the same words she'd read at the funeral 6 months earlier. Her voice was so much stronger now, steady and clear instead of shaking with fear and grief. I watched her talk to Grandpa about learning piano and speaking at the school, telling him about the progress she'd made and how hard she was trying to be brave. Grief and healing were happening at the same time, Luna learning to carry her sadness about losing Grandpa, while also growing stronger and more confident. I started a blog about parenting a child with selective mutism, sharing our story to help other families understand the condition better. I wrote about Luna's journey from being silenced by anxiety to finding her voice, and I discussed Jane's recordings to help parents recognize when children were being exploited. The response surprised me. Dozens of parents reaching out to say the blog helped them understand their own kids' struggles or identify concerning situations. Several parents specifically thanked me for discussing the unauthorized recordings, saying it made them realize similar things were happening with their children, and they'd taken action to protect them. Knowing Luna's trauma might help protect other vulnerable kids gave our painful experience unexpected meaning. Winston told me he'd started therapy to process his feelings about Jane's betrayal, recognizing her crimes affected him deeply, even though Luna was the direct victim. We met for coffee one afternoon and talked about how family trauma spreads in unexpected ways, hurting people who weren't even the main targets. Winston felt guilty for bringing Jane into the family, even though he couldn't have known what she'd become. He struggled with anger at himself for not seeing the warning signs, for not protecting Luna better. I reminded him that Jane had fooled everyone, that predators are skilled at hiding their true nature. We discussed how healing required acknowledging everyone's pain, not just the primary victims, and how Winston seeking help was important for himself and for Tommy. Luna's teacher sent an email reporting that Luna was speaking more in small group settings at the school, participating in discussions with 2 or 3 classmates, even though whole class participation remained impossible. The 504 plan accommodations let Luna demonstrate her learning through written work and recorded responses instead of verbal presentations, and her grades improved significantly as anxiety about forced speaking decreased. The teacher noted Luna was making friends with other quiet kids, building relationships through shared activities rather than constant talking. Luna came home happy most days now, telling me about school through a combination of words and gestures, her world slowly expanding as she learned to manage her anxiety instead of being controlled by it. Mom called the following Saturday, asking if I wanted to help sort through more of Grandpa's things stored in her garage. We spent the morning opening boxes neither of us had touched in months, finding old photo albums and loose pictures stuffed in envelopes. I pulled out a photo of Luna at age 3, her hair in pigtails, and flipped it over. Grandpa's handwriting covered the back in neat blue ink, describing the day Luna had whispered her first full sentence to him about butterflies in the garden. Every photo had notes like this, moments Mom and I had forgotten, but Grandpa had carefully documented and saved. We found pictures from Luna's first day of kindergarten, with notes about her bravery wearing her backpack into the building even though she was shaking. Photos from a family barbecue showed Luna hiding behind Grandpa's legs, and his note explained she'd been overwhelmed by noise but stayed for 2 whole hours, a huge achievement he celebrated. I sat on the garage floor reading through dozens of these notes, crying at the evidence of how closely Grandpa had watched Luna's small victories. Mom suggested we create a memory book combining the photos with the birthday letters he'd written, giving Luna something tangible she could look at whenever her confidence dropped. We spent the next week organizing everything chronologically, adding our own notes about what we remembered from those days, building a record of Grandpa's love that Luna could hold in her hands. Mom's phone rang while we were finishing the memory book layout. She answered and her face went tight, listening for several minutes before saying she'd think about it. Jane's mother had called asking to meet, claiming she hadn't known about the stolen money hidden in her accounts and wanting to reconcile with the family. Mom sat at her kitchen table after hanging up, staring at nothing while she processed this request. I asked what she wanted to do, and she said she honestly didn't know, that Jane's crimes shouldn't automatically destroy every extended family connection, but rebuilding trust felt impossible right now. She agreed to meet Jane's mother for coffee the following week, deciding she could at least hear what the woman had to say, even if reconciliation took years or never happened at all. I understood Mom's position, even though part of me wanted to refuse any contact with anyone connected to Jane. Mom reminded me that Jane's mother had been kind to Luna at family gatherings before everything happened, and cutting off potentially innocent people because of Jane's actions made us just as cruel. Luna's therapy group scheduled their performance showcase for a Tuesday evening in early November. Parents and family members filled the small community center room where the kids had been practicing for weeks. Luna sat with her group, clutching a butterfly hand puppet she'd decorated herself with purple glitter and pipe cleaner antennae. When her turn came, she moved to the front with 2 other kids, and they performed a puppet show Luna had written about a butterfly who loses her voice after a scary storm. The butterfly puppet couldn't sing anymore, and felt broken until she discovered she could make music by playing a piano with her wings. Luna manipulated her puppet through the story, her face serious and focused, and the other kids provided sound effects and background voices. The metaphor wasn't subtle, Luna processing her own journey through this simple puppet story, but watching her share something so personal in front of 20 strangers showed how far she'd traveled from the terrified child who couldn't speak at Grandpa's funeral. I cried watching the butterfly puppet learn to communicate through music instead of songs, seeing Luna tell her story in the only way she could manage right now. After the showcase ended, several parents approached me saying their kids had similar struggles, and Luna's puppet show helped them understand their own children better. Nora called 3 weeks later with news about the civil case. The judge had awarded a judgment against Jane for $75,000 in damages, covering the stolen money plus compensation for emotional harm to Luna. Nora warned that actually collecting this money from someone in prison was nearly impossible since Jane had no income, and any prison wages would be minimal. We could potentially garnish future earnings if Jane ever got released and found work, but full recovery might never happen. I told Nora I understood, that having a legal judgment acknowledging what Jane did to Luna mattered more than the money itself. Mom agreed when I shared the news, saying the court validation that Luna had been genuinely harmed carried weight beyond financial recovery. We'd gotten back $40,000 from the hidden accounts, and while we'd never see the full amount Grandpa intended for Luna, we'd recovered enough to secure her future educational opportunities. Luna approached me one evening while I was making dinner, standing quietly until I noticed her waiting. She asked in her soft voice if she could take piano lessons to learn how to play Grandpa's piano properly, instead of just picking out random notes. I contacted 3 teachers before finding one who had experience working with anxious children and understood selective mutism. The teacher's name was Mrs. Rodriguez, and she met with Luna for a trial lesson, letting Luna sit at the piano without pressure to speak or perform. Luna came home happy after that first session, showing me the simple exercise Mrs. Rodriguez had taught her using only gestures and written notes. Piano became Luna's primary way of expressing emotions her voice couldn't convey, her fingers speaking through music when words felt too hard. She practiced every day after school, sometimes for hours, working through beginner books with fierce determination. I'd hear her playing the same measures over and over until she got them perfect, the repetition soothing her anxiety in ways talking never could. 8 months after the funeral, Luna's teacher sent an email that made me cry at my work desk. Luna had spoken a full sentence in class that morning, asking a question about their science project on plant growth. The teacher wrote that she'd nearly dropped her coffee mug in surprise, and the whole class had frozen for a moment before continuing normally, giving Luna space to process her breakthrough without making it a huge deal. I picked Luna up from the school that afternoon and hugged her tight, telling her how proud I was. Luna shrugged and said it had just felt like the right time to ask her question out loud, that she'd been thinking about it for days, and the words finally came out. The next day, she went back to silence at the school, but that single sentence proved her comfort zone was expanding even if progress wasn't linear. Her teacher understood and continued accommodating Luna's communication needs through written work and recorded responses, celebrating the breakthrough while respecting that Luna couldn't speak on command. Mom called me in December to discuss an idea she'd been developing. She wanted to establish a small scholarship at the local community college in Dad's name for students with communication disabilities, using some of the recovered funds to create something positive from Jane's theft. The scholarship would cover tuition and books for one student per year who faced challenges like Luna's, ensuring Dad's legacy included supporting young people who struggled to make their voices heard. Mom worked with the college's financial aid office to set up the structure, and they agreed to name it the Albert Whitfield Communication Disability Scholarship. The first recipient would be selected the following fall, and Mom asked if Luna wanted to help choose the winner when she was older. Luna nodded when Mom explained the plan, saying quietly that Grandpa would like helping kids who had trouble talking like she did. Winston called in January saying his divorce had been finalized the week before. His wife had left him 6 months earlier, unable to handle the stress of Jane's crimes and the constant legal proceedings affecting their family. Winston sounded tired but relieved, saying the marriage had been struggling for years, and Jane's betrayal just accelerated the inevitable end. Elias's divorce from Jane became final around the same time, and our family reconfigured around these new realities. We were smaller now and definitely more cautious about trusting people, but we'd also grown closer through surviving betrayal together. Winston, Tommy, Mom, Luna, and I formed a tight unit bonded by shared trauma and the choice to heal rather than let Jane's cruelty destroy us permanently. We started having dinner together every Sunday, creating new traditions that didn't include the toxic people who'd been cut from our lives. Luna spent an afternoon writing a letter to Grandpa that we planned to add to her memory book. She wrote about learning piano and speaking more at the school, telling him she was trying to be brave like he'd taught her even though it was really hard sometimes. She wrote that she missed him every single day and wished he could hear her play his piano. She drew butterflies in the margins and signed it with a purple pen, then carefully placed it in the memory book between photos of them together. I read the letter after she went to bed and cried at her honest words. This tangible proof that Luna carried Grandpa's lessons with her even though he was gone. Dr. Barr scheduled a progress review meeting in February and suggested reducing Luna's therapy to twice monthly instead of weekly. She explained that Luna had made remarkable progress over the past year, developing better tools for managing her anxiety and expanding her comfort zones significantly. Dr. Barr emphasized that Luna would likely need ongoing support through major life transitions like starting middle school or high school, but the intensity of weekly sessions wasn't necessary anymore. We discussed how selective mutism might always be part of Luna's life in some form, that complete recovery wasn't really the goal. Instead, we focused on giving Luna skills to manage her anxiety, so it didn't control her choices or limit her potential. Luna seemed pleased about the reduced schedule, saying she liked therapy but was happy to have more free time for piano practice and playing with friends. My boss called 3 weeks later asking if I could return to full-time hours starting the following month. I'd been working reduced hours since Grandpa died, taking afternoons off for Luna's therapy appointments and court proceedings. I worried about how Luna would handle the change, but her after-school program director assured me they could accommodate her needs. The program had 2 other quiet kids who rarely spoke, and the staff was trained in communication differences. Luna surprised me by adapting better than I expected. She came home each day with drawings she'd made with a girl named Sophie who also struggled with talking. The 2 of them communicated through pictures and playing side by side, and Luna seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months. Another boy in the program used sign language, and Luna started learning basic signs to communicate with him. Watching her find friends who accepted her silence felt like a gift I hadn't known to ask for. She'd spent so long feeling different and wrong, but these kids understood what it meant when words wouldn't come. Luna asked about her birthday party 6 weeks before she turned 8. She wanted to invite her therapy group friends instead of kids from the school. I contacted the other parents through Dr. Barr, and they all seemed relieved their kids had been invited to something where they wouldn't be pressured to perform socially. We held the party at our house with just 5 kids total. It was the quietest birthday party I'd ever attended. The kids played board games and did art projects, communicating through gestures and occasional whispers. There was no loud singing or forced group activities. Luna smiled more during those 2 hours than I'd seen in months. She and her friends understood each other in ways typical kids never could. They knew what it felt like when anxiety stole your voice, when speaking felt physically impossible even though you desperately wanted to talk. Watching Luna laugh silently while playing with kids who didn't expect her to be different made me realize this was the best gift I could give her. She needed people who accepted her exactly as she was, silence and all. Mom called one evening in early spring sounding nervous. She told me she'd started seeing someone she met at her grief support group. His name was Richard, and he'd lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. I felt surprised but happy for her. She'd been so focused on supporting Luna and managing the estate that I hadn't thought about her own loneliness. She asked if she could bring Richard to dinner so Luna could meet him. I agreed, warning her that Luna might not speak at all. Richard turned out to be patient and kind. He didn't pressure Luna to talk or make a big deal about her silence. He brought her a book about butterflies and left it on the table without demanding acknowledgement or thanks. Luna picked it up later and spent an hour looking through the pictures. Mom seemed lighter than she'd been since Dad died, and I realized she deserved companionship after everything she'd been through. Richard understood grief in ways most people couldn't, and he respected Luna's communication style without treating her like she was broken or strange. Nora scheduled a final meeting in late April to close Grandpa's estate officially. The legal proceedings had dragged on for over a year, but everything was finally settled. Mom would distribute the remaining inheritances according to Dad's wishes, now that Jane's theft claims were resolved. Luna's college fund was secure with the recovered money and Mom's contributions. The piano legally belonged to Luna with documentation proving Grandpa's intent. Several family heirlooms came to our house, including Grandpa's watch collection and the quilt his mother had made. Nora handed me the official documents showing Luna as beneficiary of the college fund, and I filed them carefully in our safe. These tangible items represented more than money or possessions. They were proof of Grandpa's love and his faith in Luna. He'd seen past her disability to the brave, determined person she was becoming. He'd protected her future even when family members tried to steal it. Every time Luna played his piano or I looked at his watch, I'd remember that someone had believed in her completely. A letter arrived from the prison 6 weeks later with Jane's name on the return address. I opened it carefully, unsure what to expect. The words felt hollow and self-serving from the first sentence. Jane wrote about how hard prison was, how she'd lost everything, how lonely she felt. She claimed to be sorry for what she'd done, but her apology focused more on her own suffering than the harm she'd caused Luna. She wanted forgiveness so she could feel better, not because she genuinely understood the damage she'd inflicted on a 7-year-old child. There was no real acknowledgement of recording Luna without permission or trying to ban her from Grandpa's funeral. No understanding of how her cruelty had traumatized a vulnerable kid who'd just lost the one adult she trusted completely. I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer. I didn't share it with Luna. Some apologies weren't worth the emotional cost of receiving them. Luna was healing and moving forward. She didn't need Jane's inadequate words dragging her backward into pain. Luna's piano teacher scheduled a spring recital for all her students in early May. Luna had been practicing a simple piece for weeks, and she asked if she could dedicate it to Grandpa's memory. Her teacher thought that was beautiful, and offered to read Luna's written dedication, since Luna probably wouldn't speak in front of the audience. The recital was held in a small community center with maybe 40 people attending. Luna wore her purple dress and butterfly necklace. When her turn came, she walked to the piano with her paper clutched in one hand. Her teacher read the dedication Luna had written about Grandpa, teaching her that brave butterflies don't need to roar. Then Luna sat down and played. Her fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, and the simple melody filled the room. She made a few mistakes but kept going, just like Grandpa had taught her. When she finished, the audience clapped warmly. Several people had tears in their eyes. Luna's teacher hugged her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Later, Luna told me the teacher said communication takes many forms and all of them are valid. Music was Luna's voice when words wouldn't come, and that was perfectly okay. 1 year after the funeral, we gathered at Grandpa's grave for a small memorial. Just Mom, Winston, Tommy, Luna, and me. Luna brought flowers she'd picked from our garden and a recording of her piano piece on my phone. We stood around the headstone while Luna placed the flowers carefully. Then she asked to play the recording. The music drifted across the cemetery, and Luna whispered her poem. Her voice was steady and clear this time. Grief no longer stole her words the way it had a year ago. She'd grown stronger, braver, more confident in her ability to speak when she needed to. The selective mutism hadn't disappeared, but she'd learned to work with it instead of letting it control her. When she finished the poem, she touched the butterfly necklace and smiled. Mom put her arm around Luna's shoulders. We stood there quietly for several minutes, remembering Dad and everything he'd meant to all of us. The pain of losing him hadn't gone away, but we'd learned to carry it together. We'd survived betrayal and trauma and come out stronger on the other side. Winston called a few days after the memorial saying Tommy wanted to learn piano too. He'd been listening to Luna practice during their weekly visits and wanted to play duets with her. I thought that was incredibly sweet. The boys' cousin bond had strengthened through everything they'd been through together. Tommy had stood up for Luna at the funeral when she couldn't speak, and she'd never forgotten that moment of bravery. Now he wanted to share her love of music. We arranged weekly practice sessions at our house with Luna's teacher supervising. The kids worked on simple duets, Tommy's enthusiastic playing balancing Luna's careful precision. They laughed together when they made mistakes and celebrated when they got a piece right. Watching their friendship grow through music felt like a beautiful outcome from painful circumstances. Grandpa would have loved seeing his grandchildren connect this way, supporting each other through shared creativity. Luna started third grade in September with noticeably increased confidence. Her teacher called me after the first week reporting that Luna had spoken in class 3 times already. She'd answered a math question, asked to use the bathroom, and volunteered to help pass out papers. These might seem like small things to other parents, but for Luna they represented huge progress. The selective mutism hadn't disappeared completely. She still went silent during stressful situations or with unfamiliar people, but she had better tools now for managing her anxiety. She understood that her voice mattered even when it was hard to use. She had more faith in her ability to speak when she needed to. Her teacher was patient and accommodating, never pressuring Luna to talk, but celebrating every time she did. The 504 plan remained in place, providing alternative ways to show her knowledge. Luna was learning that she could succeed in the school even with her disability, that being different didn't mean being less capable. Mom and I started a new family tradition that fall. Once a month, we'd have dinner together and share favorite grandpa stories. Winston and Tommy joined us, and sometimes Richard came too. We'd go around the table taking turns remembering funny things Dad had said, or special moments we'd shared with him. We laughed and cried together, keeping his memory alive for Luna and Tommy. Luna contributed stories too, her voice growing stronger each time as she claimed her place in the family narrative. She talked about how Grandpa had called her his brave butterfly, and taught her that hearts speak louder than voices. She remembered him letting her play his piano even when she hit wrong notes. She shared how he'd been the only adult who never pressured her to talk, who accepted her silence as part of who she was. These dinners became sacred time for our family. We were honoring Dad while also healing from everything Jane had done. We were choosing love and connection over bitterness and fear. Luna was learning that family meant people who showed up for each other, who protected the vulnerable, who celebrated the quiet victories alongside the loud ones. I started getting messages through my blog about a month after I began writing about Luna's selective mutism and what Jane had done. The first email came from a mother in Oregon who said my post about unauthorized recordings helped her recognize that her son's gymnastics coach had been filming him inappropriately during private sessions. She'd reported it, and the coach was under investigation now. Then a father in Texas wrote saying he'd noticed his daughter's teacher paying unusual attention to her autism behaviors, and my story made him ask questions that uncovered the teacher was documenting kids for some kind of research project without parent permission. More messages kept arriving, parents thanking me for sharing our nightmare because it gave them words to describe what felt wrong in their own situations. Each email hurt to read because it meant more kids had been treated like Luna, turned into subjects instead of people. But knowing our trauma helped protect other vulnerable children gave everything we'd been through a different kind of meaning. Jane's cruelty had accidentally created something good, turning our worst experience into advocacy that helped families I'd never meet keep their kids safer. 3 weeks later, Luna climbed into bed and asked me to sit with her like I did every night. She held her butterfly necklace from Grandpa and looked at me with those serious eyes that always made her seem older than 8. She said she thought Grandpa would be proud of her brave butterfly growing stronger, and I told her I absolutely agreed because it was the truest thing I knew. We'd built a life where Luna's voice mattered whether she was speaking or playing piano, or drawing pictures that said what words couldn't. Our family was healing in messy, imperfect ways. Nobody pretending the scars weren't there but choosing to grow around them instead of letting them define us. Luna still went silent sometimes when anxiety grabbed her throat. Mom still cried on Dad's birthday. I still had moments of rage thinking about Jane's betrayal. But we'd learned that love and safety could be rebuilt even after someone tried to destroy them. That family meant the people who showed up and stayed and celebrated the quiet victories alongside the loud ones.